I just finished making some mixed bouquets for a local country store where we sell our bouquets at during the growing season. And this is despite the fact that I take the month of July off. And what that means is that I don't have a huge focus on selling during the month of July, but rather it's full on maintenance of the field and making sure that we are prepared going into fall. So after we drop this off at the country store, we're actually going to take a tour of the field and show you what it looks like. We're going to talk about plants that have been in the ground for a couple of months, plants that are in seedling phase, and plants that I have still yet to start and hopefully we'll get a fall flush out of. So this is going to be a great video for those of you, especially in your beginner years, where you might be struggling with succession planting, especially for those fall blooms. But I also want to talk about you're going to see that the field is looking pretty bare right now. You're going to see that I actually wasn't able to harvest that much from the field today, yet I'm still able to make these type of mixed bouquets. Now, I'm not making a ton of them. We dropped 3 off yesterday. We're going to drop 4 off today and probably another 3 over the weekend. And that takes us to about 10 bouquets in addition to some other a la carte bouquets that I have. I sometimes have some wholesale orders throughout the weeks of July. So I'm able to still maintain a baseline sales while really focusing on maintenance. I definitely want to talk about that some more. But in the meantime, let's get these dropped off at the country store. We are back from the country store and it's been super exciting because I've been participating in my own Double Your Facebook Following Challenge and it's working because these bouquets are moving. So when I went to go drop off, they were all completely sold out from yesterday and hopefully we'll be able to bring some more tomorrow. But for now, let's talk about July in zone 7A in New Jersey. So for those of you who are new to my channel, I am in my 3rd year of flower farming and I typically focus my videos on the business side of things. But one of the things that I really struggled with, especially in year 1, was having consistency in blooms, but especially later in the season. I think as beginner growers, we get super excited, we put everything out, and then we kind of forget about the later part of the season. So this year in year 3, I had a very intentional effort to make sure that that didn't happen. And in fact, my intentionality was really focused on the couple of months before July and the couple of months after July, because this time of year is pretty slow for really anyone. A lot of people are on vacation. It's not high flower sales volume, but we are hearing that it's going to be pretty busy in the fall, especially for our wholesale customers, so specifically designers who design for weddings. So I want to talk about first crops that are in the ground and that are on the cusp of blooming, but will actually continue to give me fall blooms. First up, we've got everyone's favorite, and that is dahlias. So this is just one of a couple of rows of dahlias. This is what good looks like because it's being netted, which from the storms yesterday, I'm really glad that these got netted because I'll show you some that didn't get netted and what happened. But we are starting to see buds, which is really, really exciting. Now, most of these dahlias were pinched, so otherwise I would probably have dahlia blooms a little bit earlier. But you can see they're doing really well. They're healthy. There's a little bit of interplanting here with snapdragons. So we've got just a bunch of the same varieties. I think there's 3 specific varieties in this space. All right, so let's talk about what I did differently with dahlias this year. And I think this is really important for those of you who sell wholesale and retail and sell at a relatively smaller scale like mine. So just for perspective, this is a 40 by 90 foot field. Obviously it is fenced to keep deer away. We have very, very high deer pressure. I have relatively generous walkways over here. So it's kind of like half the growing space, and it's actually not a full 40 by 90 because I was so overwhelmed last year that I shrunk it. But I say this because last year and the year before, I grew a bunch of different varieties of dahlias. And from a retail perspective, totally fine, because whatever comes into bloom, you can just put into a bouquet. The problem with dahlias is that if you've grown them, you'll know that they don't have a very great vase life and you can't hold them for more than a couple of days really. So they are a fast moving crop. And if you're trying to sell wholesale, it doesn't help that you have 2 stems of this variety and you have 2 stems of another variety. You've really got to be able to have mass quantities of the same type of dahlia. So that's why I really rehauled my dahlia growing, and I only focused on 6 varieties that I had enough tubers for. And I would say for each of these 6 varieties, I had at least anywhere from like 6 to 8 tubers. One of them I had like 10. And so the goal is to focus on growing fewer varieties, but hopefully I'll have at least, like 2 bunches coming up at a given time that I could sell wholesale. And I think that when they're at their prime, I'll definitely be able to output a little bit more, but I really struggled last year with being able to sell them wholesale because I just could not predict what buds were actually going to open a full week in advance. So I did that, and the goal is to also multiply that stock for next year from a tuber perspective. I ended up choosing varieties that I knew were popular amongst florists, ball varieties that typically have a longer vase life and holding capacity. There are a couple of exceptions that are not ball varieties, but I also chose colors that I knew would do really well retail for those bouquets that I sell at the country store. I have successfully held my dahlias in the pole barn. All I do is I dig them up. I don't even clean them, put them in some pine shavings into a plastic tub, and that's it. And I don't really fuss too much with them just because they're not like a super important crop for me. So even if something happened to the tubers, I wouldn't be terribly upset. I found that they not only held super well, they started pre-sprouting for me. So it made it easier for me to cut and divide the tuber. So I had already been able to multiply my stock from last year. And that's why I was able to grow out a few of these plants. So it's something I would definitely consider for you to think about for next year. Think about like what dahlias do for you this year. Really focus on figuring out which tubers you want to keep, multiply, and maybe double down on some of the ones that do really well for you. So dahlias are probably the only crop here that is going to be so cut and come again that I'm going to have it from, we'll call it in a week or 2, all the way to first frost. There are a few other plants that can produce that abundantly, but also withstand disease. So for example, even though there might be cut and come again crops like zinnias are very, very prone to disease. And that's why you do want to succession plant. I have some zinnias in the ground right now, but we're going to get to that later because I just put them into the ground. But right now I want to show you lisianthus, which is just starting to flower for me. And if we're lucky, maybe we might be able to get a second flush in September. So here we are with lisianthus, absolutely a crop that needs to be netted. I hate netting, so I selectively choose which crops I net. This is one of them because we had some pretty gnarly windstorms that came in the other day. And if these weren't netted, there's no way they could have made it. So you can see we actually have some in bloom. So this is Chateau, I want to say. And it's very, very ruffly. And then we've got apricot over here. And so the first bud is blooming. I mean, look at this. This is a crazy beefy stem. It's literally got, I don't even know like how many bloom heads it has. But for those of you who have never grown lisianthus before, you want to essentially pinch this if you want the others to develop a little bit more quickly. I actually don't need the flowers for at least another 2 weeks, so I'm not going to do that. I'm going to let the flowers do their thing. But ultimately, even though there's so many different bloom heads here and stems, they're not going to all open up. So something like this, if you were to cut the lisianthus, should open up in the vase, but something like this and this are actually unlikely to open up. So at a given time, you're lucky if you have like 3, if you're really lucky 4 bloom heads open at the same time, but they have a really great vase life to begin with. So even if you're harvesting at this stage, you see there's like another one over here, it should give the customer a really, really great vase life. Let's get into some specifics here. I ordered 2 trays, so plugs of lisianthus. I started some from seed. I actually germinated them, took care of them really, really well. And guess what? In March, I completely forgot to water them for a week and then they all died. So lisianthus is definitely one of those flowers where I shouldn't even attempt to grow them from seed. A part of me just want to see if I could germinate them. But anyway, I bought 2 trays and I would say that I had a decent amount of attrition. Some of them just never made it past a cold spell that we had in April, and I did not use root shield. So root shield is typically recommended for lisianthus because it is very susceptible to a fungal disease that lives in the soil, which causes basically rotting in the leaves to yellow. I did not use it, and I think some of my lisianthus did get it. I did do some crop rotation. Last year, the lisianthus were in that bed over there, and this year it's in this bed. I am still happy with the outcome in terms of the amount of harvestable stems that I will have. So it's totally fine. Root shield is just really, really expensive. You buy it by the pound. It is perishable. You have to keep it cool. So you have to do the math on these things, because if it's going to cost you like, I don't know, like I think it's $200, or maybe I'm making that up. It's really expensive though. If you're going to spend that much money and you're not growing that many plugs of lisianthus, I think it's actually worth it to take the risk. If you're growing thousands of lisianthus, then that's a different story. So that's the first thing. I did not use root shield. The second thing is that lisianthus is actually pretty day length sensitive. So if you get your lisianthus into the ground a little bit later, what you're going to find is that they're just going to be wanting to bloom. And that's why some people get shorter lisianthus. So the reason why I put this into the fall category is that if you can get lisianthus, at least where I am in July, and you cut it all the way down, you might be able to get a second flush in September. If you don't get that second flush by like mid to late September, basically you're not going to get that flush, because at that point there's just not enough day length for those lisianthus to want to flower. And that's the thing, is that you really have to understand, if you want fall flowers and try to coax flowers that are a little bit more warm loving, is what is the impact on day length and what that light does for blooming. Next up, we've got Scoop Scabiosa, which is this guy over here. Now, Scoop Scabiosa is different from regular Scabiosa because this is a hybridized version that you can only get from cuttings. You cannot get it from seed. And these guys started producing about 3 weeks ago, and oh my God, it was almost a pain to continue to deadhead them, because you want to make sure that you're continuing encouraging blooms by cutting off any stems that are starting to open. And I would say that after a lot of experimentation, I'm actually now starting to cut at this stage, because they will continue to open. In the beginning, I was making a mistake and harvesting them a little bit too late. But I'm finding that if you harvest here where there's some petals that are showing up, you'll be perfectly fine, and that will maximize the vase life for the end customer. Now, of course, if you're harvesting for wholesale and they need it for an event like 3 days from now, you're better off having this out here, having the warmer temperatures accelerate the blooming, and then harvest it when maybe there's like at least a layer or two of petals around it, and that should last them beautifully for the event, assuming that event is like 3 to 4 days out. Scoop Scabiosa is supposed to continue producing throughout the entire season. I've read that it slows down when it gets hot. It did not slow down when it got hot. A little bit to my disappointment, because again, I take July off. I only need so many Scabiosa for my retail bouquets. I'm not doing a high volume. So I spent a lot of time deadheading, and I think I deadheaded so much that the flowers are now regenerating, which is totally fine. And so hopefully they will really start outputting more in August and September, and hopefully October when I need them. We also have a little bit of Scabiosa fama, which is a perennial. Now, I had just put these in this year. They were gifted to me by a friend who actually overwintered them for me. And so they were put in sometime, I think it was like April. And so they just started flowering for me. You can see that this tomato plant has completely almost crushed the Scabiosa plant, but it's fine because this is a perennial. It will come back. I know that the other growers on my co-op have gotten Scabiosa a lot earlier this year, so I think they flowered a little bit later because they were put in late. But so far they've been pretty good, and so they've been pumping out blooms. I don't know if I'm going to get them through the fall, but right now I would say that these bloom heads are actually a little bit bigger than the Scoop Scabiosa that I have. So you can see a couple more blooms over here. They've actually cut so hard down here, so I've been using them in my bouquets and they've been doing pretty well. I mean, this area looks a bit like a weedy mess. We've got like eggplant, we've got tomato, we've even got a bean plant over here. This is supposed to be a bushy bean plant, which I guess it kind of is, but it's really a lot bigger than it used to be. And it's a testament to how good the soil is over here. And that's one thing that I've started to really notice, is that certain areas you can see that this that the investment that I've made in soil health, burying food waste in here through the b.a.r.e method. A lot of people have been asking me about it, but I will link that in the show notes, a video that I did on it. It's producing abundantly. Like this bed over here is full of that b.a.r.e waste, then layered with leaves. So you can see there's like 2 inches of leaves. It had tulip bulbs earlier in the year, then lilies, and now it's already producing tomatoes. And I'm finding that these raised beds, if I plan it correctly, can be some of the most productive spaces because of just how rich they are. So you can see over here, I've got like a really grown tomato plant, and then I've got some eggplant. And so it really re-emphasizes that if you put in the work to invest in your soil, you can really reap the rewards. I mentioned earlier that I have some dahlias that were not netted. So because these were pinched, they are super, super bushy, and they did get a little bit tossed around by the wind. Like you can see this one over here has really leaned over. So funnily, the wind actually knocked this bucket over here, which is now helping it stand up. But you can see it's kind of leaning down. So it would have benefited from some netting. This one also included. So I am going to try to support them with some stakes, but at this point, I'm not going to net like 5 plants of dahlias over here, and it'd be too unruly to net. So we've also got some tomatoes, and tomatoes have started becoming a really good crop for me to grow, not just for vegetable reasons or not just for home consumption, but also for floristry use. So what I do is I like growing some of these cherry tomato varieties, and the reason is because obviously we can eat them. I have a 15-month-old who is starting to like berries as a whole and any type of fruit, but I can sell a stem like this. And what you find is that the designers who are a little bit more artsy and designy, they like working with foliage, especially the ones that have fruit. And tomato foliage is pretty robust. It roots in water, so it's pretty long lasting. But of course, if you can get these cherry tomatoes, it makes for a really great design. So I wouldn't write out vegetables, especially if you are growing them for yourself, as a way to also upsell foliage, especially for designers. You can also put them in your bouquets too. I tested this one out. This one's called Midnight Mile, and it has some variegated foliage. I haven't yet sold it at the co-op because this is the first time that it's actually grown so big, but I think that this would also do pretty well. The problem is that the tomatoes are a little bit bigger, and so it's not as easy to work with as something like this, which wouldn't fall off in an arrangement, but potentially they might fall off if they get a little too big. But I'm actually curious to see how the foliage does. I also grew stuff like this pepper specifically for the foliage. And what I'm finding is that certain peppers are obviously a lot stockier and other peppers are a lot bigger. So you can see something like this, where if I could take this entire stem and sell it as foliage and it were to have some fruit like this, it could actually do pretty well for a designer who has an event with that kind of license to be more creative. I love multi-use plants, especially ones that I can also eat off of, but that takes us to basically the end of the plants in the ground that are flowering right now and that I expect to continue to produce for me for at least 2 more months. So in order to produce for me for over the next 2 months, they have to be able to hold off against pests. So there's different cycle of pests that come in, but they also have to be resistant to disease. So things like tomatoes typically always will die because of some disease that overtakes them. And it's just important to mulch underneath to make sure that if the water splashes up, soil-borne diseases don't overtake it. Next up, let's talk about a flower that I've started to fall in love with again. And I've realized that I grew it really badly in the first year. So this is your cosmos, your typical cosmos. I love cosmos because they have a really short days to maturity. Cosmos is cut and come again, but you will want to succession plant them. So this succession will probably take me through the next month, but I would need another succession in order to tide me over. And the good news is that I do have other successions coming. So you can see right behind over there, there is some cosmos that are coming in. But the point is that cosmos are one of those flowers where it's Short days to maturity, really easy to grow. You don't need to fertilize it a ton. I found that it did benefit from some fertilizer in the beginning as seedlings, and then kind of just let them go. Obviously, you want to make sure that they are getting water, but they are producing really stocky stems. I like growing the double variety. So this one's cranberry double click, and that typically gives you a much better vase life. And you can see that there are multiple buds per head. So when it starts flowering, one might actually be open in a bouquet, but then the others will open throughout time. So it helps give it a longer vase life. I find that if you get a really good stem with multiple bloom heads, you could be looking at close to a week of vase life versus one bloom head just having 3 to 4 days. So definitely a crop to consider. If 60 days out, you're looking at what you have and you're like, oh, I don't really have that much. Seed Cosmos, I direct seeded all of this. It literally germinated within 48 hours. And I would say that if you're direct seeding this now, they should germinate pretty quickly because of the weather. But as we get closer to fall and the days shorten, the days to maturity will be a little bit longer. This was actually direct seeded in mid-May. We are in mid-July right now. And so I would say it is a full 60 days to maturity, even with that intense day length and heat that we've been having. Along the same veins of a crop like Cosmos, we've got two other crops in here that are very similar. So we've got celosia here. This is self-seeded celosia, and this is after me thinning. Clearly, I didn't thin enough. So when you get a really, really good celosia, like a stocky stem of celosia, you will have multiple branching side shoots. When you squeeze them in too close, they will self-regulate and obviously look like this. The heads are a little bit more petite. There's still a place for these. They're obviously not going to fill up a bouquet, but it's still totally usable. So, but celosia, I'm talking about this, is a great crop, again, because for fall, it has a relatively short days to maturity. If you direct seed it right now, it should actually germinate pretty easily. And this is a great filler for you to have 60 to 80 days out, depending on what type you're trying to grow. In the mix over here, you're also going to see some zinnias that I have. This is the Dawn Creek Blush Zinnia variety. I had actually direct seeded this before I realized that the celosia had self-seeded from last year and kind of started out competing some of the zinnia. I'm actually growing this zinnia for seed purposes because they're really all like within the same color palette. So it's totally okay if the pollinators are pollinating across this like blush pink versus this more creamy, like yellow blush tone. So I want to save seed for next year so that I can grow a lot more of these out. Again, zinnias are open pollinated, which means that they will get pollinated and cross-pollinated by the different types of varieties that you have. So if you've got like some red and like very saturated purple b.a.r.e giants, they might actually hybridize with this, and then what you get next year may not be true to color. Could be a really cool variety, but I'm selling zinnias to florists for weddings, and this type of color is a lot more desirable. I've got floret zinnias out that have just been started, so I'll give you a progress update on that. But I just wanted to show you what celosia could look like if you allow it to self-seed and not thin it out as much as you should. All right, this row is like Interplanting Central, and it's actually working out pretty well right now. I've got a couple of perennials and a few annuals in here. This here is echinacea. It's actually double scooped echinacea, and I've tested putting this in my landscape, and by far it's doing the best in here, primarily because the soil is better. We've also got Silver Shield over here, which is a filler that I love. I had a high amount of attrition with this because I put it in way too early and basically frost killed like literally 100 out of 120 plugs. It is what it is. It's totally fine. This is an annual that I learned does well with shade. So this was an experimental piece over here. I had put a lot under cover of my yarrow plants, and those unfortunately all died from the frost that we had. But then in between over here, you can see I have some ageratum or ageratum. And ageratum, I'm starting to find, is a really, really fast days to maturity plant, especially if you plant from plugs. Let me actually show you some ageratum that has been even, or that is even further along. So again, a little bit more intercropping over here. We've got some other self-seeded celosia. This is actually flamingo feather, but this is ageratum that has really bulked up and taken off. And I would say we're probably 2-ish weeks away from blooms, which is really exciting. And these all came from the same tray. They were just planted out at different times, which is kind of interesting because I didn't realize you could actually potentially succession plant based off of that. You can see I have some more ageratum over there too. It comes in a tray of like 200, so there's a ton, and I was just running out of space. So I decided to intercrop it, and I'm seeing that it is benefiting from having a little bit of shade. This is a field that gets full sun. It can get really hot. Last few weeks, I think everyone was in a heat wave. So I think the fact that these were getting shadowed out by this crazy celosia. So this is a great example of celosia that is bulked out because it had the space to bulk up. Like you can see how many side shoots they have. It benefited from the shade, and that's why it's growing so well. I do want to talk a little bit about this over here because even though it's so nice to have so many side shoots from one celosia, what you find is that they start curving. So the curving is okay up to a certain extent if the stem is long enough, but sometimes it actually becomes unusable because the curve is just so great that it's like it's hard to put it into a bouquet and you can't really sell it for florists. And that's why I actually don't mind if my self-seeded celosia is too close together. The bloom heads, of course, are a little bit more compromised, but again, there is a space or a place for smaller bloom heads of things, especially if you're selling wholesale. People typically might need to make like boutonnieres or flower crowns, and at that point, you don't want like a big flower. A smaller type of bloom head could actually be more beneficial. All right, so we're going back to this row because there's another flower in here that is a pure experiment this year pilot, and that is mums. So I've got some mum cuttings that we put in. This was probably put in the week before July 4th, so it's been a couple of weeks. They are putting on growth. And the thing to remember with mums is that you actually don't want them to take off and get too tall quickly right now. This is a true fall flowering crop. The ageratum, I think, will actually be flowering probably from August through a little bit of early September, but the mums are not going to start flowering until basically October. And these will need to be frost protected because these are flowers that are really great if you're trying to go beyond dahlia. So typically dahlias will stop flowering obviously after the first frost. They get killed by the frost. So if you can protect things like mums, they will continue to output flowers for you, and some people are actually even able to get them through Thanksgiving for where I live. Typically those are people who grow with high tunnels. I am actually going to be investing in caterpillar tunnels to make sure that this row of mums will live beyond frost. And so the goal is that the ageratum will be done probably in like by mid-September. These will get pulled out, at which point then the mums will actually have more space to grow. So again, trial with mums and also with intercropping. I just don't have the amount of space to grow all of this by itself. And so the intercropping is a bit coming out of necessity, but I am also seeing that intercropping is helping some of the flowers actually grow really well next to each other. Another new crop that I'm trying this year that is supposed to be also very close to how dahlias perform is actually called curcuma. And also similar to dahlias, you can propagate the little tubers that they have. This is a tropical plant. It's actually also known as Siam tulip. It is grown in Asia where it is really humid. And as we get to crazy weather like this, where it is a super humid July into August, flowers like these might actually thrive here. So it's cut and come again, and it's supposed to flower until frost. So I am just starting to see buds come in through, or starting to see the makings of a bud come through. So I'm pretty excited to see how they turn out. But if all goes well, I should be able to cut off of these until first frost. And this is what it looks like. So this is curcuma. They take a while to get started, but once they get started, the leaves really start outputting. And this is what a stem looks like. So it's just starting to put out the bud, and you can already see what the habit is going to look like. I can't even explain what this flower looks like. It looks awesome. A local farm was actually growing them in Shirley, has some for harvest, and they sold out almost immediately. So again, this is a trial. I ordered 50 tubers, and I honestly got some started so late that they didn't even come up. I think they might have rotted, but I have about 20, I would say, that are in pretty good shape. So again, trial, we'll see what the output is on these and whether or not it's something I would invest in more of next year. So at this point, we're now moving on to crops that were just more recently put into the ground. Most of these came in as plugs, and so they've already started putting on a good bit of growth, but these crops are really meant for true fall blooms. So this is true succession planting, where I expect blooms to be anywhere from 45 to 60 days out, and this is what they look like right now. So this section over here is marigolds, and I have never grown marigolds for cut flowers. I've grown them more as companion plants, but they've been doing so well at the cooperative, and just I love how bulky they can be in a bouquet. So I started growing some. I mean, this is pretty incredible when you think that this came in as a plug and it was put into the ground last week. We had a healthy dose of rain from the storms that we had, and it's really helped some of these plants take off. So again, cut and come again. And the reason why you want to make sure that you're continuing putting in new young plants is because you are reducing the risk of disease taking out a plant that you would have put in that is cut and come again, but is going to eventually get tired from you cutting so much. And so I like to rotate the crops, the types of crops that I'm putting into the ground too, just to also prevent disease and that kind of stuff from like sitting in a bed and taking over a future crop. I also want to show you an experiment that I alluded to when I showed you a week behind on the farm in July. These are quartet stock plugs, which is typically not something you would be growing this time of year because stock is a cool loving crop. I wanted to experiment and see if I put shade cloth on these seedlings, would they be able to produce for me in about 45 to 50 days? Because stock quartet is not one and done. It is cut and come again. And I just wanted to see if we could get fall blooms from these. So this is another experiment and trial. This is the row of the stock plugs that I put in. And honestly, given how hot it's been, they look pretty good. So they've continued to put on growth, and they are green still. And I've only fertilized them once, but this part does get watered pretty well by me mechanically. And the goal is to just keep these alive and growing, and hopefully by the time it gets cold, they will do their thing and thrive the way stock should. Now we're getting to the babies of the field right now. So over here, you can see we've got zinnias. These are the floret zinnias. This one's golden hour, literally started a week and a half ago. So we've got second set of true leaves already coming in. And so the reason why I grow zinnias later in the year is to avoid the Japanese beetle from chomping down on them, as well as hopefully avoid powdery mildew, which happens typically when it's June and July. So far I've experienced really great germination. I even did a video on it to try to see if I can increase germination. I found that all of them germinated pretty well despite the two things that I tried to do to test them. And yeah, like we're just gonna let them do their thing. And I'm really hoping to be able to cut from these within 60 days, which brings us to sometime in like mid-September. And hopefully that will bring us to the end of fall. So I only have one succession of zinnias for that reason. So as you can see, most of the stuff in the ground, we have a staggered bloom time between in a couple of weeks all the way out to, we'll call it like early frost, which is sometime in like mid to late October for us. And part of the challenge, it's like playing a chess game. You need to see what your current move is right now, but then you also need to be able to see a few moves down the road what the game is going to look like. And that is basically, what is the weather going to look like and what is going to be blooming and not. So one thing I definitely recommend for you to do if this is like your first season or you've struggled with this is take the zoom out approach, which is look at the remaining months that are left in your growing season. So we've got August, September, October, and maybe November for some of you guys. We've got 4 months left at the most. What are the flowers that you currently have that you would expect to bloom for each of those months? And once you start figuring that out, you're going to start seeing some gaping holes. And that's when you start plugging and playing. So for example, I know that a lot of people right now are probably swimming in blooms. They're probably swimming in blooms that they've put out sometime in early spring or even from their second succession. But a lot of people start dropping the ball this time of year because it honestly starts getting hard. But fall is a really, really profitable time to sell flowers because, again, there's just more interest in flowers. People are not on vacation as much, and it's not as great as spring, but it's definitely better than summer. So you want to make sure you're doing your homework that way. If you don't know when to anticipate blooms, just do a quick Google search and see when the days to maturity is. Take a photo, put it into a local Facebook flower group and ask people, how far off do you think this is from blooming? And people will give you an opinion. And that's a great way to also plug in that calendar to see where the gaps are. I would say that increasingly I am starting to rely on my perennials, and I know that some of my spring perennials may also give me a second flush. So let me show you what they look like right now. The first one is actually feverfew, and I keep on saying I want to cut this down, but what happened was I had thrips, so I didn't have the chance to cut down all the way down. Instead, I cut the bloom head. And what ended up happening was it triggered growth on the side. And it triggered growth so quickly that now I actually have feverfew that I've been using for my mixed bouquets. Now, are all of these stems great? No, but there are definitely pockets of great stems. So I've been able to effectively use these in my bouquets, which is awesome. I mean, you can see like this patch over here is looking pretty good. So this was surprising for me, but I think that if I were to hack it all the way down, I would definitely get a shorter but usable flush sometime in like late September. So that's one thing for you guys to consider if you are growing feverfew. All of this now, if you've been looking at what the field looks like, it's pretty green. There's a lot of growth happening, but there really aren't a lot of blooms, right? Which might actually look very different from your farms. Again, this is intentional, but that brings me back to the beginning of this video where we saw us making mixed bouquets. Now, here's the thing. When I harvest in the morning and you look into the bucket, it doesn't look very good. In fact, it looks pretty scrawny. So the only reason why I am able to continuously make bouquets this time of year and not have to rely on things that are currently blooming as focals is because I've done my homework in terms of succession planting lilies. So if you've been following me, you know that I specialize in lilies during the growing season. And the reason why I love lilies is because they are programmable in the sense that if you try to force them during the first growing season and then you perennialize them, you will be able to time your first blooms within like 60 to 120 days, depending on when you're planting them in the variety, out from that first time. And if you perennialize them, they will naturally start blooming in the spring. The implications of that, along with the fact that lilies can be stored in the cooler for 2 to 3 weeks, is the fact that I continuously will have a focal. This is my second year of growing lilies on a pretty big scale. They are my second biggest crop, and I've learned that 1, lilies move really well retail, but 2, rose lilies move the best. Rose lilies will typically convert anyone who has an aversion to lilies, assuming that they don't have like a physical aversion to the scent of lilies. It will totally convince them to buy the bouquet because the rose lily is just unlike any other flower. It's got layers, it's got hues of colors that are just like romantic in nature, and it's very long lasting, not to mention there are usually a few buds per stem. So by virtue of me just putting like 3 stems of lilies between rose lilies and regular lilies, I am able to really, really bulk up a bouquet. And of course, that is also helped by having a perennial filler like mountain mint. This mountain mint, unfortunately, is starting to get to the end stage of its life. But because I had so much mountain mint, I put some in the field, I put some in landscaping, I put some in the backyard. So we have staggered bloom times for this mountain mint. And as a result, I've actually been able to use this mountain mint for over a month at this point, which is incredible. the combination of having that perennial mountain mint and having the reliable rose lily and lily focal has allowed me to pump out those bouquets. This is what lily isle looks like right now. It's certainly not as massive as the prior lily isle. I've also had my mistake with lilies, and I promise I will do a separate video on them. This is a great example of failed lily crates. So we'll get into that when I get into that lily video. But the point is that you can see over here, I've got successions of rose lilies that are coming in. There's actually some callus here, which is an experimental one for me this year. They've also been saving my butt because the ones that grow long look really, really great in a bouquet. So these rose lilies will actually be blooming, if I had to guess, in about another month from now. So that brings us to like later August. And I already have some more bulbs coming in. For those of you who don't know, I actually sell lily bulbs. We're completely sold out of week 29, which started shipping out today. So I'm going to get those lilies into the crates, into the ground, and those are definitely going to be blooming around the same time as dahlias, sometime in, we'll call it later September, mid-October, so squarely in fall. And I'm pretty excited to see how they do, because really when it comes to fall before frost, I feel like everyone at our cooperative is growing dahlias, and I would love to offer a little bit more of focal variety around the same price point. This over here is an example of one small patch of mountain mint that I have. I actually harvested quite a bit from this space. So this is the only patch I have in the field. You can see it's like pollinator haven right now. This over here is a separate patch that I have in my landscaping. And you can see I've cut quite a bit from it here. The reason why I want to show you the spot is you can see they have started to self-regenerate. Now, first year, I did not get a second flush. I've heard that many people are able to get a second flush once perennialized. They're obviously a little bit shorter, probably like this length, but obviously still very much usable in a bouquet. So this is what it looks like to take a break from flower farming in July. What I'm really taking a break from is the high volume of selling that I'm doing, especially at the cooperative. There's an opportunity cost to selling at the cooperative. It might just be once a week, but that Wednesday night, I am spending time uploading my new inventory, scouring the field to try to predict a week out what I'm gonna have. Monday and Tuesday is completely dedicated to harvesting. So there's a lot of effort that goes into selling. And so that comes at a cost of making sure that you can maximize what you're going to have a couple of months out. So that's why for me, July is less about maximizing the revenue that I can make by selling flowers. It's more about maximizing the future potential value or revenue that I can get from fall when it's going to inherently be busier. I also spend a lot of time making content with that extra time that I have by not needing to sell. So if you haven't signed up yet, I have a newsletter that goes out every other Wednesday, and it's basically all about flower business. We talk about selling, marketing, things that I'm even reading that are business related. So it's good stuff, especially if you want to level up selling flowers. The last thing I'm going to talk about is I've been doing this 30-day Facebook challenge. I've closed the challenge right now because we had so many people who signed up, but it's going pretty well. So I'm excited, but every single day I'm basically pumping out an email, and that takes a lot of time. So the time that I have to basically take off from the farm, I can dedicate a little bit more to creating content like that for you guys. So anyway, let me know if you have any questions and comments below. If you're looking for the behind the scenes on what it's like to flower farm in July, like literally what I am doing, here's a video that I did recently that takes you behind the scenes, and hopefully I'll see you in that video.